You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
JT Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Ford,
Corey Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Charlene Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have Clare McHugh on the show with me today. She has an amazing new novel. It's called A Most English Princess, a novel of Queen Victoria's daughter. And if you're a lover of historical fiction like we are at my house, this is going to be a book that you need to have on your shelf this year. That's for sure. Welcome to the show. Welcome to the show, Clare.
Thank you, Hank.
Thank you. Clare, we begin each show with the same question. And that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
Oh, I think my first memory was at age 4 when I went to my new nursery school and I saw that there were many, many, many books on the shelf. And I thought, wow, I could write one of these. These books are so cool, and there are a lot of them. So surely there could be one more by me. And that is my earliest memory.
I love it. You know, there's kind of a magical thing that happens when you're at a certain age where one day you see books and they're just kind of ethereal. They just always have been, it seems like. And then something happens where you realize that people create these stories, and then those stories get bound up in books, and then they get taken to bookstores and libraries and, you know, all these places. And there's something that happens when you realize that if someone else created this book that I'm holding in my hand, maybe I could do something like that. And it's really an empowering thought when that realization comes to a kid.
Yes, and I have a specific memory really associated with that. To take it one step forward, like many young American children, girls especially, I was infatuated with the Little House on the Prairie books. And I was 4 or 5 books into them before I realized that the author's name was Laura Ingalls Wilder and the main character was Laura. Oh, I thought, this woman is writing about her own childhood. This story is essentially true, and she is taking memories of her own life and making them into stories and binding them into books and reaching across the years to people like me. And that revelation strengthened my interest in being an author.
That's amazing. I love hearing those stories. And yeah, I read those books when I was a kid. And then I read them to my children when they were small, and that realization that the narrator is the person who wrote the books, and then, you know, her life went on to be vastly different than those stories. It's such an awesome thing to experience yourself, but then to watch in others as well. Yeah. So you had an interesting childhood. You said like other American kids. But where were you born?
That you come to the heart of it. I'm actually English by birth. My mother is an Englishwoman, and my father is an American, and they were living in London when I was born. And I spent a great deal of time as a child in London and around, actually in my aunt's house outside of London, in a place called Cobham in Kent. And my parents eventually settled in New York, outside of New York City, where I grew up, and then later in Baltimore. But my connections to England were ongoing through the years. My mother talked often about her own childhood and the childhood of her parents. My grandfather on that side was a soldier in both world wars. History was something, British history in particular, was something we discussed often. So my connections to England were enduring, and I went there many times, both as a child and as a young adult. And my interest in the royal family springs right out of coming from an English family.
So, how how much was, let me rephrase that. How old were you when you realized that you were kind of these two worlds? You were an American kid, but you had this very strong English heritage, and or was it something that was just kind of always understood by you, or when did you realize that your parents were, from two different countries and two different continents, and what kind of effect did that have on you?
It's a super good question because I cannot remember a time when I was not conscious of that. And partly it is, as children are, in a world where they compare their parents a bit. My parents were always thought to be rather strange because, on the one hand, in the Westchester County of suburbia of the 1960s, my mother was older and foreign. She had a heavy British accent, and also children pointed out all the time, why are your parents always reading books? They were thought to be, odd. My father is a psychiatrist, also a sort of odd profession. My mother's Britishness came out in many different ways. For example, she always was endorsing wearing the same clothes for 2 or 3 days before they were dirty and then throwing them in the laundry. She was a person who grew up, in austere post-war Britain, and there was no waste was allowed. And also she used her own English expression. And I remember arguing with my second grade teacher when I wrote an essay about our rockery. The garden behind our house had these rocks, and my mother referred to it as the rockery. The second grade teacher told me no such thing existed. A rockery was a made-up word. But, then I told my mother, who laughed hilariously and, found the reference in an English dictionary and had me said, the sense of being from two places, or at least having a foreign mother, was always with me. And I, of course, as an adult, I think this is a tremendous strength. As a child, I was a bit self-conscious about it.
So Claire, you mentioned earlier, that wanting to be a writer, wanting to create books. A lot of times we have these early desires, and they get sidelined by, raising families, needing to pay bills, and all of these things that come, along. What was it for you? Did you kind of put that desire on a shelf for a while? Or kind of what was your experience with going through life with having this thing in the back of your mind, but not yet pursuing it?
Hank, your questions are very good ones. When I went to college, I didn't really believe that I could be a writer, certainly a fiction writer, right off the bat. I worried that I had nothing to say, and I was also very interested in history at that time, as well as English. So I studied history in college, and when I graduated, I did start experimenting with writing fiction, but I needed to make a living, and I was pretty confident that I could not make a living with my fiction at that time, which is the mid '80s. So I went into journalism and magazine editing because fiction was not, I thought, a viable action. I didn't think I had that much to say or was very good at it at that point. And journalism is a great background for a fiction writer because you're constantly trying to string together events that you've reported on into a coherent story. So it was great. It was great training. And I just kept moving up in the journalism world. And I became editor of several different magazines, which is quite well paid. I wanted, then I had children, and I wanted to send them to school. And so, yes, for many years, I was distracted by making a good living and an interesting living in magazine publishing. And the magazine business, though, has gone kaput just about the time when I thought maybe I could write a novel. The two things happened together. When I stopped working as a magazine editor, I started working on this book.
So I've met lots and lots and lots of authors by doing this show, and there's an uncanny amount of people that that spent time in journalism that then become fiction writers. And on the surface, I could enumerate any number of skills that a journalist would have that would help a fiction writer. But what is it for you? What did that time in journalism? What are some of those tools that it gave you that make you a better fiction writer?
The number one thing that journalism made me a better fiction writer is I realized, because in journalism you just have to do it. You can't wait. Stories, the fire that happened on Smith Street, you have to write about it right now, because otherwise in 3 days no one will care about the fire on Smith Street and they won't be hungry for the information. They will have gotten it somewhere else. So if you're a journalist and you're reporting, you have to get on with it. The most important thing about journalism is putting your butt in the chair and writing it all down in a coherent way. So journalism gave me the sense that, if you put the time in, you can write some good stuff. The second thing that journalism gave me, beyond this kind of readiness to get on with the task, is the importance of hooking the reader and keeping the reader interested. So you probably heard that, journalists talk about who, what, where, and when. But most of all, it's important to have a good lead, like, can you believe that the fire on Smith Street, consumed 3 other houses, but started with a broken pilot light? Like, you have to have something that seems very intriguing right up front, and then you have to keep the reader going all the way through by introducing interesting information and also signposting. And then it gets better. So that kind of commitment to the reader's experience is very much part of journalism. And then the final thing I think I learned is the importance of small details, getting the right detail that brings a scene alive for people. You might go to a fire or a car accident, and there'll be many, 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 many details that you could choose to put in your story, but you have to write only 800 words. So you have to pick the detail that's going to be most resonant for people. So that also is a skill that helps with fiction.
Papyrus Author was designed and developed with the modern writer's needs, wishes, and preferences in mind. From big structures right down to tiny details, every single feature of our software has been carefully and meticulously crafted in collaboration with authors. Take charge of your writing with the author interface, which gives you access to different elements of your story, such as characters' backgrounds and narrative structure. Move sections of your writing seamlessly in the navigator and evaluate the complexity of your text with our expert style and readability analysis. Never worry about losing progress with automated backups. With Papyrus Author, you can be your own writer, editor, and publisher. The world of writing is about to change. Papyrus Author, the word processor for authors, has arrived on the international stage. Unrivaled in its scope, it is the first software suite to unite every single step of creative writing. The vision behind Papyrus Author is to empower everyone with an idea to turn it into a great book for free. A word processing core that matured for over 10 years at its foundation, Papyrus Author goes beyond the text with its intuitive organizing layers for story, characters, notes, and research. The powerful style and readability analysis help raise manuscript quality. The inbuilt publication capabilities take the book directly to the reader with ebooks, docx, and print-ready PDF. Visit papyrusauthor.com to get started today. Well, not only the most resonant for people, but especially if you're in a larger city or maybe a national story, you may have a story that's covered, 80 different times by 80 different people in 80 different ways, and there has to be a nugget in there that makes your story stand out from the rest, to bring not only things that are important to the story, but maybe something a different way of looking at it, and that really cuts through the crowd of other people that are viewing the same story as you. And that, when you're, like in your book, A Most English Princess, we've got characters that we all recognize from history, but you look at them at a different angle and bring out their humanity. And which is always what I love about historical fiction, is that especially the farther away that we get from an historical event, the less we know about it and the less that we teach in school, because there's too much to cover. So these things get reduced and reduced and reduced down to bullet points. And that's the great thing about historical fiction, is the ability to add some humanity back to these bullet points. So having said all that, what was it about Vicky that captured your imagination? And when all of the stuff happened in magazines and all of that, and you started looking at different ways to express yourself, what was it about this story that grabbed your attention?
Thank you. That's a really good question. As you say, I wanted a subject that would really engage me in my first effort after my magazine career. I think that Vicky spoke to me for several reasons. First of all, it's you might think it mundane, but I noticed, I've studied the royal family. I've written about the royal family as a journalist. I've watched a lot of movies about the royal family. I share the interest that many people have in it, but I had picked out Vicky among the huge cast of royal people because I thought something about her situation really spoke to me. Like Vicky, I'm the eldest in my family, and I have a brother just a year younger. In Vicky's case, she was the eldest, and because her brother was born just a year afterwards, she was no longer heir to the throne, and she could never inherit her mother's throne. She was known in the family to be the most clever and most capable of the royal couple's 9 children, and she's the eldest, but the laws of succession at that point meant that she would be passed over for the crown. Something about that poignancy of that position spoke to me. I thought, well, that I would feel terrible if I was I'd feel unjust. Children, especially children, have a very strong feeling of justice. They want things to be fair. And that's why I start my book with Vicky finding out that it wasn't really going to be fair, that because Bertie, her younger brother, was a boy, he was going to get to be heir and not her. So the starting point of my interest in Vicky was that poignancy of that position she found herself in. But I was also interested to see that she made a great effort in her life to make the most of what position she did have. And I'm interested in German history and the history of the rise of fascism in Germany, as many of us are, since we all live in the shadow of those wars and the unbelievable horror that was brought on by a German nation state gone wild, gone barbarous. But where did that begin? It didn't begin with the Nazis. It began really with the formation of Germany in 1871. And Vicky, this woman who was in this very poignant position, was right there as an eyewitness. And so that furthered my interest in her. What did she do with her life when she was forced to go abroad and marry a foreign prince who, thank God, she loved passionately? So the other thing about Vicky, like me, I'm passionate about men and have had and lucky to be married to a wonderful person just like Vicky, so I could relate to that. But then I wanted to see what she was like and what happened to her in a very difficult political moment where she had no direct influence. She could only be in the background, but using her great brain to try to make things better. All those things together attracted to me to the character, and I thought that by telling Vicky's story through fiction, I could show other people how interesting she was, and that is the real privilege of a novelist, to allow us to go into somebody else's head. You don't have to stick to the facts. You can go into someone else's head and tell the story of their life the way they experienced it.
Very well said. One thing that always gets me when you read novels, about the past. We live in the 21st century now. I have 3 daughters and 2 sons, but there's something. There's a disconnect when you start looking at the way the world once was, for vast swaths of history in different places, and you see that Vicky here is a beloved daughter Not only is she the brightest and the most clever and all that, but she really has a great relationship with her family. Yet the circumstances are what they are, and she, eventually gets married off for political expediency. Now, granted, she loved the prince, and all of that turned out well, but the fact of the matter is that not only are you passed over for the crown and for all of these things, but you get married off, and such a bizarre, thing for us to wrap our heads around. And I think about me and my daughters, and just the, uh, you know, uh, how do you get into that mindset to so that when you're telling the story, you tell it, um, from a place that is true to history and to true to these mindsets, while still having a 21st century sensibility. Does that make any sense at all?
Yes, and you're getting to the very heart of it. And I think it's really important to try to understand. The task of a historical novelist is to avoid presentism. You cannot depict these people as having 21st century attitudes, because they didn't. And the novel won't be authentic, and it won't be worth reading unless you're reading a book in which the characters behave in a way that they did actually behave. Otherwise, it's fake and it's flimsy. Um, and when I was approaching, I agree with you totally. One of the most touching things about the story of Vicky was that she was a really adored daughter. She had her trouble with her mother. Her mother was could be very controlling and mysterious, but she loved her mother, and her mother loved her. And of course, her father adored her. And he, in some ways, he said later that she was his favorite person in the world. But he took that favorite person at a very young age, and he shipped her to live with some really awful people in a really nasty, misogynistic foreign world, right? So at the time, they all thought it was going to be okay, and that this was Vicky's duty. And you notice that Vicky doesn't say, "Okay, I'm not going to do it." She thinks, right, okay, this is what I was born to do, essentially, and I'm going to be a force. I'm going to be a force for good. And thank God, yes, that Fritz and I are really passionately in love. But in the end, she was used, and
Right.
and in a way that we can't conceive of using our own offspring, and that we feel kind of angry. I am angry a little bit at Prince Albert that he did not think really how was it going to be like for Vicky day to day. And when things went wrong, the tragedy of Vicky, of course, is that her first son was born handicapped, and then she ran up against a force of much greater power than her, Otto von Bismarck, a political leader without moral scruples. She was in a very difficult position with all the good intentions of her family didn't prevent that from happening. I hope people read the novel as I intended it to be, which is to show Vicky as a transitional figure. In one way, she's very modern, and the letters that she writes to her parents, on which I base much of the novel, show you how interested she is in modern ideas and in the education of women and the care of the sick and the growth of democratic institutions. At the same time, she's also a person of her time, and she wouldn't say things like, "Well, I can't put up with this," or "This is really unfair to me." Like, that's not the way she thought. And so I hope that I convey the nature of the situation, and also the way she thought about it, in a way that is authentic to the time that she lived.
Absolutely. Vicky is a fascinating character for all of the reasons that you have enumerated. Um, but what's really equally fascinating is that Vicky is a character on this huge global stage, during a time that would change all of our lives. The kingdom of Prussia, then becomes Germany, and all of these, geopolitical set pieces start moving around, and she has a front row seat for that. And how much did Vicky have? How much political influence or control, maybe control is not the right word, but influence, did she have over the way things were going in Prussia, and how the future would unfold?
As it happened, Vicky did not have as much influence as one might have anticipated she would have. And it was a combination of several things that happened, that limited her influence. She had a tremendous influence over Fritz, her husband, and he learned a lot from her and from her father about the way constitutional monarchies in the 19th century were evolving to give the people's representatives much more power. And in England, it had happened in really a bloodless way. The Parliament had more and more power, and that the royal family played an important role as head of state, but a role that was not determinate. The Parliament really did it. Now, Fritz believed this, and to a great extent, and he believed that what Vicky thought about government and the role of the royal family was correct. However, his father, whom he would inherit the throne of Prussia from, lived to be 90. So for many, many years, Fritz and Vicky were waiting in the wings, and they had very little power, not only because they were waiting in the wings, but because Otto von Bismarck, who really controlled Fritz's father and told him the way things should be, sidelined them further. Had Wilhelm, who was Fritz's father, died when he was expected to die at age 70, Vicky and Fritz would have ascended to the throne of Prussia, and the unification of Germany, which was accomplished by Otto von Bismarck, empowered by the Prussian throne, the new nation would have taken on a very, very different cast. As it was, they could only comment from the sidelines, and they made a lot of important comments, like saying, anti-Semitism, which von Bismarck fanned the flames of that, is odious, and they used to go to synagogues to show that their support for Jewish people, as well their interest in changing the caste system in Germany to be less brutal was also, people wrote about it and they were able to say it. But the very, very bad luck was, as soon as the king did die at a very advanced age in 1888, by that time, Fritz, who was Vicky's husband, had a fatal throat cancer, and he died 99 days after he ascended. And Vicky's son, Wilhelm, was not a supporter of his parents' liberal values. So Vicky was really shut out. First, she was shut out by the fact that her father-in-law lived to an advanced age and was under the control of an autocratic chancellor, Bismarck. And then she was shut out by her son, who inherited the throne. And he actually fired Bismarck, but he took up with a lot of other people who were not as competent as Bismarck and yet very right-wing. So Vicky had very limited influence, and that's a shame.
So you've identified the character of Vicky, and you know that she has a fascinating story, and you want to tell her story. Where do you begin to research the characters, and she's one of these characters that's fascinating, and we know a lot about her, but we don't know a lot about her, if you know what I mean. And one thing that I love about your book is it opens and you give us this grand cast of characters that we're going to meet and experience in the book, and you get the feeling immediately that this is a huge story and on a grand stage, and then the story begins and the focus comes in very narrowly, and we're in the heads of people, and we get to know them. How did you begin to research and find the thread of the story that would make up the book?
That's a key question. Thank you. I started my research by reviewing the biographies, both written of Vicky and of her mother, of her father, Fritz, of Bismarck, of all the big main characters. But really, I only found my way. I only conceived of how the story should go once I started reading Vicky's letters to her mother and her mother's letters back. Now, many historians know about this grand cache of letters. There are almost 8,000 of them because they exchanged letters, mother and daughter, for over 50 years. And the Queen is talking all the time about what's happening to her in Britain. And Vicky is talking about all the time of what's happening to her in Prussia. But when you read Vicky's letters, she comes alive on the page as a very hilarious, funny, sympathetic, sometimes complaining, sometimes you can feel her. So I thought, well, that these letters have to be really the basis of the book. I can't really rely on the biographies because the biographies are only they give you a little bit of scaffolding, but they don't tell you a lot about the heart of the person they're writing about. Whereas these letters are very, very personal. And then I found out that we're very, very lucky that these letters survived because the Kaiser, Vicky's son, wanted them burned. And when I found out the story of how they were saved, I thought, well, I'm going to make this dramatic incident about how these letters were saved by Fritz Ponsonby, one of Vicky's brother's courtiers. How I'm gonna tell that story at the beginning because it raises the stakes. You see what was the interpretation of Vicky's life and whether Vicky was a good or not good person was started. At the time of her death. And this book is based on the letters. So I'm going to do both. I'm going to show with that dramatic opening chapter, I'm going to show that there were a lot of stakes involved with Vicky and what she did and didn't do. And also that the letters were the key to understanding her. So when I had that as my starting point, I used that as the preface. And then I decided, okay, I'm going to go right back to the beginning with Vicky. Because in order to understand Vicky, you have to understand how she felt as a small child, growing up in the royal family and finding out that she wouldn't be queen and what would happen to her instead. So I do think, and I have to ask you, I like a list of characters when they're going to be a lot. I like them in the front of the book, but some people are turned off by a long list of characters. Are you?
Oh no, I loved it. I loved kind of getting this sense of knowing ahead of time what I was dealing with and who I could expect, and it helped me to sink into the story, as it were. From time to time, I would think, oh, this is where this character is going to come in. It really enhanced the story for me.
I'm glad to hear that. I like it too.
I do too. I loved it. So Claire, when you have a historical figure like this that you've worked on and you put so much time and care into the story, when it's finished and when people are hearing this show, the book is going to be newly available and you can go buy it at your favorite bookseller right now. When this book gets out into the world and you no longer have any control over, because up until publication there are things that can change and all that, but once the book is out there, what do you, as a writer, as a creative person, what do you start doing with yourself? Do you is this creative energy, does it start coming up again, like there's another topic that you want to delve into, and are you ever truly satisfied when a book goes out to the world and you can no longer have any input on it?
I am not in any way truly satisfied. If I could suddenly have the book back, I would change some things about it, because it's very hard. You always want it to be better and the best. Yes, I'm happy with it, and I worked extremely hard on it for 2 years. My hope for the book is that that people who are interested in it will find it. There are a lot of books published now, and this book, I think it's great, but it's about things that I'm interested in. I think a lot of other people are interested in too, about the royal family also, but mostly about the development of women, how women find a path through life, how anybody makes choices to try to find purpose and do their best in challenging circumstances, all those things. And also the entire history of Germany and the founding of Germany 150 years ago now, I think is historic, a story of history that's just hardly unbeatable, because the facts are almost more interesting ever than fiction. You could never make up a story as good as what this story really was, as tragic as it was. But to answer the other part of your question, it's so scary not to be able to, when you write a book, you can control what you put down on the page. When you send a book out to other people and to be sold, you can't run up to people on the street and say, read this book. I think it's really good. You're really going to like it. You have to hope people find it. And that's hard for someone who likes control like I do. So I'm struggling a little bit with that. I can't, I send it out now into the world with all my hopes, but to distract myself, I'm working on another one, because I learned a lot writing this book. And now I want to put everything I learned into writing another book. This one probably set in the United States in the 50s and 60s. I've just started it. It's not resolved yet, but I'm working on it.
I love it. I cannot wait to see what you come up with next. The new book, A Most English Princess, a novel of Queen Victoria's daughter. When you're hearing this, it's available everywhere now. We put links to it in the show notes of this episode to make it easy for folks to find it. Claire, this has been so much fun chatting about the book. If people are fascinated with you and want to dig into all the great stuff that you do, is there a place where they can find you online?
Yes, my website, ClaireMcHugh.com, I have all of my other writing and more information and background about the book. So I hope people will go there. I'm also interested in hooking up with book clubs if people want to read the book and then have me speak. I am very open to that. And so I hope people will look for me at ClaireMcHugh.com.
And you have some great resources in the back of this book for book clubs and for discussion groups and people that really want to use this book as a springboard for bigger ideas and things like that. So, the book, there's a link to it in the show notes of this episode. We'll put links to your website as well. And yes, this would be a fantastic choice for your book discussion group, your book club, and we highly recommend it. Claire, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show.
Oh, thank you. This has been really fun.
Do you ever wonder if a person's critical thinking comes at the expense of their own happiness? Is it possible to be very happy and still practice excellent discernment? I used to wonder the same thing. Then I discovered the Trouble in Paradise podcast with Nigel Kent and Jasmine Starr, where they laugh as well as think about conspiracy theories and unexplained phenomena without ever getting bogged down in the age-old tug-of-war between logic and feeling. The Trouble in Paradise podcast is a joyful program for critical thinkers who have a sense of humor. Join Nigel and Jasmine as they probe the intriguing and wacky culture of odd occurrences, strange news, and ridiculous coincidences on this hilariously intelligent podcast. Trouble in Paradise on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and Stitcher. Follow @Tipcast239 on Twitter. Trouble in Paradise with Nigel Ken and Jasmine Starr, a happy podcast for critical thinkers like you.